readers. My name is Dawn Hughes, and I'm the new Booktrib book club coordinator. We're here today with prolific author Lance Lee to talk about his latest book, Family Matters. In it, he records his famous family's turbulent history amid their well-known entertainment ventures. I'm sure you've heard of them. His father's production of fan favorites, Dr. Kildare, Bonanza, and The Addams Family, which is seeing a bit of a renaissance lately, I suppose, the spin-offs from it. Personally, I can't wait to get my hands on this book. Family Matters is one of the books taking part in Booktrib's book club program for June. Thanks for taking a few minutes out of your, I'm sure, very busy schedule, Lance, for a bit of a rapid fire Q&A.
My pleasure. Go ahead.
Please tell us a little something about the book. I read a very brief intro, but please tell us something about the book we wouldn't read on the jacket cover. No spoilers, obviously.
The jacket cover, I wrote, it's a pretty inclusive blurb. Working on the book, the things that really fascinated me were twofold because I didn't know them in advance. One was the way family myths develop and go on from one generation to the next and do ultimately sometimes traumatically fade out. And the other is the way the inheritance of that works, and also of parental patterns being passed on, where circumstances might radically change, but each parent who has not examined their own past, hasn't gone into therapy, hasn't come to terms with it, recreates a situation in which they make themselves feel comfortable, which is not a healthy situation, obviously, and they pass that on to their kids, whom they make feel the same way they felt. And you have to break away from that sometimes to see it. And to do anything about it. It's like on a family level, the old adage, if you don't know history, you're bound to repeat it. And it works on a family level too. So those are two things that really, as I got into it, opened my eyes.
I can imagine they would have. What sort of prompted you to write the book in the first place? Like, how did you, this is a family stuff is very personal, obviously, and not only that, you have a family that's been in the public eye. So
much so, yeah. No, I knew one day I'd have to write about it. I would occasionally tell friends some of the stories, very excerpted from contexts that were funny, if told just that way.
Yeah.
But going back meant reliving it. And I just wasn't able to do that with any kind of balance until one day I picked up one of my father's diaries. He kept them for something like 20 years, which are fundamentally unreadable. They're compilations of who I met when and where, and what I thought about things and what happened, which is his extremely idealized version of what happened that bears very little resemblance to reality. So it started off with my reading his recounting of my birth, which was always subject to all sorts of stories in the family. And I finally called my mother up, I was 60 at this point. That's how long it took to start dealing with us. Called her up and told her what he'd written. And she was in the home at that point, but still completely mentally competent. And she simply blew up. And I finally heard her version of the story, which didn't match his at all. And then I finally started doing some research, and I was in the situation where when I started to look, there was a ton of material, because he never threw anything away, no matter how embarrassing. She never kept anything, but her mother, who always lived with us, did, except it never had a date on it or what magazine or where something had appeared, because her mother was determined the time didn't apply to her family.
Right.
But between those and which was a mountain of material, and then talking to relatives and occasionally my sister, whom I'd call up and I'd relate some incident that I was writing about in a negative light that sounded so positive. And I'd ask her, am I nuts? What do you remember of this? And she'd say, "Oh no, that's absolutely right. That never happened. What you're saying is dead on." So I was pretty sure I got it right.
Wow, that's incredible. Are you nervous about your family reading it? Or
Oh, they've all been, slowly one by one reading it.
okay.
I just found out some of my nephews are reading it and discussing it with their wives and having a good time because they're sort of educating their wives into what they've married into in terms of history.
Perhaps a little late, but okay. What, whatever works. Aside from a compelling read, which I'm certain this is there something that you hope readers take away from this? Is there, I'm certain it was probably somewhat therapeutic for you to write this or something, but what do you hope readers take away from it?
Well, when you write something like this, it is a kind of exorcism. You do have to relive it. You
Yeah,
go through it and you put it in context.
yeah,
And it's still there. You still think about all these things. It's who you are. It's what you came from. But what readers should take away is it's far better to remember. They don't have to write books, but
yeah,
it's better to remember and think through what happened just as a bearing witness to your own life, which in part will help you make sure that whatever faults you see in the past, you're not under some new guise repeating yourself.
right,
Because if you don't do that, if there are any faults from the past that you're blindly repeating, they're just going on. But it's good to remember because if you don't, then all of that's lost.
right.
And it's much better for people to know and pass it on, even if it's done strictly within the family and someone isn't an author and composing it.
Right. You certainly have had success with your books, and this is not your first book, obviously. Who would you say has been a great inspiration to you in your writing?
That was one of the questions you sent, and that's hard to answer because there have been a lot in different times. I think of myself primarily as a poet, but I've been influenced in all sorts of directions, never in a way in which I wanted to imitate someone,
Of
but
course.
I'd read something and think, oh, you can do that. And I'd be freed up to do it in my own way. And it doesn't matter whether it was someone in the American or English tradition. One of the poets who had that kind of effect on me was Pablo Neruda, who wrote a famous poem called The Heights of Machu Picchu. And I didn't want to write like Neruda, but that was a poem written with a particular kind of freedom. And I just sat back thinking, oh, that's great. I can do that. You're not bound not to do that. But you grow up with all sorts of elements in your own tradition, and sometimes you're not even aware you're bound by them. When I read Shakespeare's sonnets, I already knew Shakespeare. What struck me was the sheer grave music of the lines. And in terms of American influences, you can't not read Whitman and be tremendously moved by him, not just for what he says, but and the rhythm of it, but for the sheer freedom of the verse, particularly the earlier versions of some of the poems, because he kept rewriting them over 30 years, a bit like Wordsworth did with the Prelude. So a short poem would turn into a major work and lose its freshness and originality. But the early Whitman is brilliant.
I
So
think,
it was a variety just on that score.
yeah,
And in other respects, it's a real combination. One of my favorite authors is the 19th century writer Emerson.
mhm,
Underneath the purple prose, which is capable of putting any sensible person to sleep, is a revolutionary who saw the importance of individualism and individual integrity, but also thought the deeper you looked into yourself, the more you realized your connections to others,
right,
which is a point of view that's been largely forgotten. Or, in the last century, somebody like Freud, you can disagree with a lot of his conclusions are and realize he really didn't understand women at all. And yet his view of the mind's complexity and his frankness in dealing with it are really often the grace with which he wrote about it. He got the Goethe Prize in Germany, which we don't often realize in English, as for the sheer grace of his writing, aside from its power or controversy. And there have been other influence like Greek myths. There's a whole group of contemporary women. This happens periodically. People rediscover the myths and suddenly they're writing about them. And there's a group of women now writing very feminist views based on Greek myths. I think there's one, Natalie Haynes, who wrote a book called 1,000 Ships. Well, it's the elite Trojan women, including Helen, after the fall of Troy, waiting to be handed off. And the portrait of Helen is memorable. So it's simply a lot of different things that have influenced me in different ways. One of the children's stories I'm working on is at its root based on the Greek myth, and the children's youth adventure novel that I published a couple of years ago, Orpheus Rising, is a retelling of the Orpheus story with a happy ending in modern families. So it's a little hard after you've been around for a while. There are many different directions that you have been influenced from.
I will have to say, though, that was one of the most comprehensive and different answers I've ever had to that question, simply because, and I mean that in the greatest way, because you've taken, so often we read, especially as writers often read with an eye to like, oh, I wish I could write like that. Whereas you've really taken an analytical look at why those authors or those books have inspired you or influenced you in a way that has nothing to do with, copying in any sense. It's really about, I love how often you said freedom in that, is being
absolutely
freed by that.
And the key writers of just being set free from some of the shackles of middle class upbringing.
Right. Yeah, fascinating. This may seem like a difficult question to answer them, but is there a book that you've read in the past year that you would recommend that you just think is kind of resonating with you in this moment?
Yeah, I liked very much Matt Haig's book, the Midnight Library, which was actually a bestseller. It's rare to have a really good book also be a bestseller, and his was for some time.
Right.
And it's a delightfully imaginative book about a young woman who keeps living alternate lives until she's able to see her own perspective and live it. So it's kind of science fiction in a very down-to-earth, immediate way.
Interesting.
And it's just fun to read, which you can't often say about a lot of books.
Correct. That was another book. That's another book I need to add to my TBR for sure. Thank you. I truly mean that I could talk to you all day about books and your work and literature, but unfortunately I do have to wrap it up. So I want to thank you for taking time to talk with us. I know you've been busy. For more information about Lance and his new book, please check out the book club page on the booktrib.com website. Thank you very much.